Let me just introduce our sponsors who are not here, but our sponsors are Calavo, Mary Matava, there they are, Westpac, Nutrient, Ag West, American Credit, Brokaw Nursery, Westphalia Fruit, and thank you, United Water Conservation. They provided this building and the IT support so that we can do the hybrid Zoom. Yeah, so the way we're breaking this down is we're going to have a panel discussion on Thrips, how to manage Thrips if we come into the same situation that we had last year. And we've got a panel group of consisting of Dave Machlitt, Jane. I don't see Jane though. Where's Jane? So we may have to delay that and put up our speaker, Bodil CAS. Bodil is going to be talking about the leaf roller, leaf miner that has spread from San Diego up here. And maybe we're going to put you first. Is that all right, Bodil? Bodil CAS is our new entomologist at UC Riverside. And as a Riverside entomologist, she's learning all about avocados in Ventura County and San Diego in the coastal region. And one of the things that's happened here is this invasion of leaf miner. It seems to be worse in some areas, and it's delayed. We still don't even have a full name for the thing. So Bodil, please come up.
Good morning. I'm really happy to be here. This is my first avocado meeting. I know some of you from the citrus meetings that I've been attending. I put my photo up for the people on Zoom. I don't know if there's a camera, you can see me. I've just started this position at UC Riverside about 6 months ago, and the subtropical fruit integrated pest management lab at Riverside. So it's citrus, avocado, dates, any specialty crop that we sort of grow in this area, looking at the best pest management, entomology pest management practices. Before this, I was at the Department of Agriculture in San Diego County for a few years, doing like insect identification on nursery shipments from, the dog team and the inspections. And prior to that, at UC Davis for 5 years, working in citrus pest management in the Central Valley. So there's no ACP there. It's a different, pest situation. But now getting started at Riverside and starting to work on avocados as well. So it's really great for me to be here and connect with the avocado growers. So this is my contact information. I think we now have the phone working. The website's not quite there yet, but will be soon. I don't have cards yet, but we're sort of getting set up. Okay, so as I mentioned, right now I'm sort of doing a needs assessment. Part of my motivation is to hear from you, like what the research needs are in avocados and the other crops you might grow, as we sort of work out what our sort of experiment plans are. So one thing that I've been hearing about is this Caloptilia. So I'll sort of give an update. I think you might know, if you've seen it out in the field here, you might know more about it than I've heard from this area. I've been hearing about it in San Diego. And then I'll mention a couple of other potential projects with lace bugs and other ideas. And then just a couple of like current issues, fruit flies and honeybees we'll just touch on at the end. Okay, so this Caloptilia, this leaf miner, leaf roller, was brought to the San Diego County Department of Agriculture for identification in 2020. I believe it was found in the North County area. And this was before I was working there. This was Tracy Ellis. I think it was right before she retired. So it kind of got brought in, and then there was a gap, and then it sort of, I guess, didn't get followed up on. So it was this damage. Let's see. Okay. Oh, yeah, you can see that here. So it's when we found it, we thought it was two different pests, one causing this leaf mining damage here, and then a different one on the same plant causing this leaf rolling. But when it was sent to the Sacramento lab for identification, it turned out it was one insect, two different life stages. So it's this this is what the Caloptilia genus does. They start off as a leaf miner in their young larval stage, and then at one point come out of the leaf and then make a little protective sort of cap on the end as they get bigger. So they're gracillid caterpillars that have this like really neat biology. So not two different things, it's just one. They also, on the sample that was brought in, there was a Hymenopteran parasitoid. You can see here, you can see it as like an ectoparasitoid. I guess they grew it up and it this is what emerged, but it's a parasitoid, so the CDFA lab won't identify it. I guess that's where it got left. It's just a beneficial parasitoid of unknown species. So when this was sent to CDFA, it was given a C rating. If you're not familiar with the pest rating proposals, it's sort of a risk assessment when they do an identification of any organism. So A is high risk and not present in the state. That's like federally restricted. You can't import that to California. B is when it's high risk, but it's established in some counties. So like high risk would be something like spotted lanternfly, like lesser snow scale. There's insects that we know have like a broad host range, are potentially very damaging to the agricultural crops that we grow. High risk are things that are high, potentially damaging, but are already established in some counties. So like South American palm weevil, pine tortoise scale, glassy wing sharpshooter, they're all B rated because they're endemic now in some counties, but other counties might want to prevent their import. So like you can't send glassy wing sharpshooter to, Napa Valley. So that's B rated. And then C rated is most of everything else. It's like insects that feed on plants. They're potential pests, but they're widespread. We're not doing anything about them. There's no regulations except for like cleanliness. If you can't sort of ship nursery stock that's covered in them. So that's most things get a C rating. D rating is beneficial, spiders, parasitoids. So this Hymenopteran parasitoid is D rated. And then Q is unknown. We couldn't identify it, need to investigate. It could be damaging, but we're not sure. So that's kind of equivalent of an A rating. So like immature scales, you can't identify them. So they get a Q rating, but they kind of get treated like an A. So this Caloptilia, even though it wasn't identified to species by CDFA, it was given a C rating. That's probably everything in that genus gets a C rating. There's other examples. So you can, this website where they put pest rating proposals for organisms that don't have a rating is kind of interesting to read. They give kind of the history of these organisms that are getting a rating. And then you can comment if you think it's, a accurate or a useful designation that it gets. So this was another Caloptilia that feeds on azalea. It was given a C rating. So it's probably just they identified it to genus and then that's as far as they need to go. But in this case, so C rating, it doesn't mean that it's not damaging. It just means it's not being like pursued as a quarantine pest. So then the next, that was 2020, 2021, we're seeing it more from San Diego to Santa Barbara. We're having to start to treat for it. So it's in the fields, and we don't know, like without the species, we don't know, like, is it something that was on another plant and has adapted to avocado? Is it something that's come in from somewhere else and, you know, it's sort of there now and we missed the introduction? So it's a bit of a mystery, and now we're seeing it. These are Hamutahl's photos from this area. So here you can see sort of the damage it feeds on the flesh. Doesn't seem to feed on the fruit. You can see here, this is like the minor stage, and then it's emerged and rolled the leaf here for the largest stage. Here you can see some of the little caterpillars here with the damage. It seems to prefer the flesh, just feeding on the young, like the young leaf tissue. So potentially a big issue on small plants. I've heard it can defoliate like a new avocado tree. Here in, this was like 2 weeks ago in Valley Center, San Diego. We think, I mean, this isn't identified officially, but it has this characteristic. So the Caloptilia have this conical leaf rolling shape that's different from other leaf rollers in other like different genus designations. So this is very likely to be the Caloptilia. PCAs in San Diego said right now it's like from Valley Center through Fallbrook up to Duluth into Riverside County. Like right now, there's a lot of it out there. We sampled at UC Riverside AgOps over the last 2 weeks and didn't find it there in any of the avocado plantings on campus. They're all mature trees, but they have flush at the moment. This adult was collected in an area that had a lot of damage. So this is so far the most likely adult that we, like photo of an adult that we have. It probably looks something like this. This is a different Caloptilia, but so they're small, like about a centimeter big, like a less than half an inch, quarter of an inch size as adults. Like they're something like the citrus leaf miner is what they'll like probably look like. They have this sort of cute way of standing with these like they're wearing boots or something that like angle is, you know, I like the insects even when they're pests. So this this is probably it, but we haven't been able yet to rear it in the lab because it's hard to, you know, bring a whole avocado tree and then we haven't got it to hatch in the lab yet to have an official like known photo of the adult. And then for identification, even if we you know, have specimens of the larva, if there's like this group of Microlepidoptera, no one, like they're just not well studied. There's a lot of them, a lot of the species, like there's not a lot of sequence data. They're just really hard to identify. So it might be that, you know, it could be an undescribed species. Wait, it's a Gracillidae. Yeah. Yeah. So it's much smaller.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh.
No. People on Zoom want to know.
If it's a close relative of pink bollworm, but no, it's smaller. Yeah. So this is the azalea leaf miner. So it might look something like this. Some of them are really pretty colorations. We don't know what this one looks like as an adult for sure. So this Caloptilia, they are around. This is from Illinois. They roll like maple leaves and just other plants out in the environment. This cone shape is sort of a characteristic of that of this genus. They don't produce like a silk cocoon like some of the other larger caterpillars. That they will have some silk, but they're not like closing the like tent with like they're not pinning it down with silk. So that's also diagnostic that they don't have that like silk wrapping of or like stitching of the leaf. So other larvae that are like leaf rollers in avocado are much bigger. So there's I'll read this. The looper, the Western avocado leaf roller, and the orange torix. So these two are like the bell-shaped larger ones. They'll like even this one is still bigger than this leaf miner leaf roller. And these don't do the leaf mining. They just like chew the leaves down. And then they have like a different like cocoon, like a lot more silk in the cocoons. So it's not those. And then there are other Gracillidae that will feed on avocados. So like the citrus peel miner is in this group, and they can occasionally feed on avocados. This group, the Phyllocynistis from this is from Colombia. There's a couple of these species that are like in this genus that are quite damaging. Some of them sort of bubble the leaf, and others mine the leaf and also the fruit. So this looks probably similar, but it's not this. So these are like more the size that we're like sort of more what we're looking for. So it's not these. This one is here, but these haven't been found in California. And then there's these records of this Caloptilia Purcell from avocados. I don't know for the identification, like it wasn't identified as this species. I would think that we would have had a species identification, but not for sure if there's no sequence available. So this was the type species designated in like the holotype in 1920. It was this is in the Canadian Journal of Entomology. It's a pest of avocado in Mexico. The larvae mine the leaves, but rarely cause significant damage. It's found in Florida and Cuba. So this is probably the closest. This is the paper. This is the entire publication is just describing the species. So it was found bred from leaves of avocado in Florida, seriously destructive to young growth. The larvae are typical of the genus. They first make a small mine between the veins of the young leaves and subsequently fold the tip or the sides of the leaf downwards. The cocoon is white, narrow, oblong, and spun in a fold of the leaf. So in 2001, there was a pesticide trial done in Florida at the Tropical Research Education Center for this leaf roller, this Caloptilia. So it was a handgun spray trial. They tested, I think, 6 different pesticides that I have on the next slide. They sampled leaf flushes, collected before and after, like 20 days after treatment. They also, so that was like a flush sample, and they recorded the number of larvae that were parasitized by an unknown Braconidae. So what they found in this pesticide trial for this Caloptilia Purcell, which is probably similar or maybe the same, we're not sure. Basically, none of they tested these pesticides, pyrethroid, imidacloprid, abamectin, spinosad. the first three seemed a bit more effective, but none of them had a significant impact. So not too promising there. They noted that more larvae were parasitized by this unknown. It was probably something like this, the wasp, that were, there was more parasitism on the untreated block of untreated trees. So that's all I've found so far about spray trials. So what I'm hearing is that we need like basic phenology, life history information, like how many generations a year, like what's sort of the development of this in the regions where it's present. What's the actual distribution? What natural enemies are out there? Are there viruses that are attacking some of it? Is it just parasitoids? Are there predators? Proper identification of the insect, if we can, with images of the adults. And maybe a systemic insecticide trial. I don't know if we can infest trees at ag ops at Riverside, like, cage some of them onto young flush or plant out some new trees and see what works. It could be a case like citrus leaf miner where it's only, it's something aesthetic that we don't need to worry about. But maybe in young trees, it's important. Maybe another spray trial. They're pretty hard to get to because they're kind of protected inside the leaf. So maybe I can just pause here and ask, is anyone
Okay. A side comment. At Broca Nursery, we were curious about the adult characteristics of this pest. So what we did is we went out, we put bags in the trees that were rolled, and we were able to get a few of the adults. So that's an idea for you to.
Great idea. Yeah.
And we took some pictures, so I can share them with you later.
Oh, yeah. That'd be great.
Somebody in the chat just said they tried Intrepid and it didn't work, but it may be just a timing issue. Intrepid's a.
So once again, for the online people, I guess the only place I've seen an issue that was close to being a past treatment threshold, in my opinion, was it was probably like a 10-15-year-old block that pretty much every leaf had damage on it and substantial damage, and it was the new flush wasn't developing at a rate fast enough where sunburn may be a potential on new fruit. So it was on the edge, but there wasn't enough fruit, and the thrips damage was so high last year that it wasn't worth making a treatment, but it was close. Like 10-15-year-old trees, so not particularly young.
Yeah, this may play into our next talk on thrips. I doubt it, but if you don't have any new growth, the thrips are going to jump straight onto the fruit. So but I have not seen that happen.
Also, a side comment. Last time we had a CAS meeting up in San Luis Obispo, they also had it up there. So it seems it's all the way up there.
Right.
And because I'm not a Native American here, so one question, who is in charge of looking at new pests? Is it the university, USDA?
Yeah, so if they're not here yet, like if they're like outside of California, then it's like USDA and the CDFA and then the counties, try to prevent the pest coming in. And then once it's established, then it becomes more of a research, what do we do about it? So then it's more the university. So like Mark Hoddle's team looking at biocontrol, and then, my group's more the integrated pest management. So we do pesticide trials as well. Yeah, that's how I see it.
Have you seen it on all varieties of avocados or just specific?
Oh, good question. No, I don't know.
There was a couple of comments on the chat here. One person was saying establishing an economic threshold would seem to be important. Another person was saying it is currently an issue in the nursery business.
Yeah, as a grower, I'm definitely going to pay a little bit more attention to those 1- and 2-year-olds. I kind of tossed it off to those hot temperatures and some funky leaf curling, and I didn't pay much attention, but definitely will look harder. The gems right next to the house that are 1 year old.
Any other comments? Yo.
Yeah, what we mostly treat thrips with the abamectin, and the tip roller will be present, and it's kind of like the same kind of control we get with leaf miner and citrus, where you treat it and within 2 weeks it's back in force.
Is there a certain time of year that this has been showing up more?
It sounds like right now, at least in San Diego area, it's like when it's at the highest numbers. I think Hamutahl had, kind of seen it year round, but I don't have like data yet.
You have a leaf flush, you see it.
Yeah,
It's out there.
leaf flush, yeah.
In Carpinteria, we saw it on the spring flush, but not on our fall flush,
Oh, okay.
or much less of it. We actually found some of the larvae had been parasitized in the fall flush.
Oh, so just quickly, another issue that I know has had a lot more research done, but in San Diego, it's like needs more work done. That's something that growers have been asking about, is this avocado lace bug. Really pretty under the microscope, beautiful like lace wings. There's there's other lace bugs on other plants that are around. This one only feeds on avocado and camphor. So it's just a feeding damage pest. Causes, sort of sucks out all the juice from the plant, and then has this like sticky waste that it produces. So it's found in the Caribbean, Mexico, and the southeast of the US. So it's pretty specific to avocados and camphor. The lace bugs don't feed on the fruit. The adults and nymphs, they just get to really high numbers on the underside of leaves. When I've seen them, it's just like, they just make the leaves kind of yuck. And Mark Hoddle's done a lot of work showing that green lacewings are the most effective natural enemies. Sanitation is really important because they can kind of survive on the dead leaves for a while. So you don't want to be moving them around fields in that way. But what I'm hearing is that in terms of like thresholds and like more detailed IPM recommendations, there's still some need there. Like we know kind of where it came from, where the introductions were. But PCAs are seeing that, you'll sort of go into a field, there's a few of them, and then 2 weeks later, like the field's overrun with these lace bugs. So these sort of unpredictable population dynamics, and like linking it with, temperature. So some sort of treatment threshold, like the timing of like lacewing releases, pesticide spray. And I'm a bit nervous to ask, has anyone seen it around here? No.
Yeah, it showed up in Carpinteria last year, 18 months ago,
Yeah.
and it was eradicated.
Okay, it was erratic. Okay, great. So yeah, hopefully that's I think you'll notice if it shows up, it tends to be around the lower leaves on the tree. And yeah, it can like defoliate around the base of the tree. So in a few kind of spot areas, it's serious. So that's another one that we're looking at. We also don't know like the host range, like is it different on the gem avocados and questions like that. So that's something we'll look at. And then just quickly, I'm sure you've heard a lot about fruit flies at the moment. I'm just mentioning this because in Riverside, it's like a major issue right now. So there's 7 different fruit fly quarantines around the state. Usually we have like 1 or 2 in a year. So this is a lot of quarantines. And the one in Riverside, usually it's like a few flies that we find in a residential area. We eradicate them and don't worry, we don't have to worry about it. But this outbreak, they found like 600 and something flies, and it's in commercial, like affecting commercial acreage. And the way that we like control for it is more for like residential, like come and bag the fruit up and, double bag the fruit and put it in the freezer. Like it doesn't work for a whole grove of fruit. So it's a little bit of a nightmare, but where it's not a disease, they feed on the fruit, so we can eradicate it, you can disrupt the life cycle. So that's just what I wanted to kind of highlight today. So this one's the oriental fruit fly. They're all, they're medfly, mexfly, they're all pretty similar in the Tephrididae. This OFF, the oriental fruit fly, it's actually like in this complex of 85 or so morphologically similar species. They have this T shape on the abdomen, which helps you identify them easily. The large ovipositor on the female that they use to insert the eggs. So this one, it's endemic in Southeast Asia. It's kind of being introduced around the world. Sometimes it gets eradicated, sometimes not. Like now it's widespread in sub-Saharan Africa. It's in Hawaii. It was eradicated from Florida, a pretty like similar situation to what we have now. That was a few years ago, and they successfully eradicated it. So it's pretty nasty. The flies lay their eggs. The larvae develop in the fruit, and then the mature larvae drop to the ground and pupate in the soil. And then the adults emerge, they mate, and then the cycle continues. It takes about a month up to 3 months in the cool weather. So the reason I bring this up is just to highlight the places where we can disrupt the life cycle. So removing the fruit, the infested fruit from the field, and soil drenches, disrupting the soil is where it's most susceptible. Spraying or trapping the adults is a lure for the males. The females are attracted to protein baits as well. You wouldn't want to put a lure in your field. And bring them to your field. We put the lures, like the baits, in, like for the females in residential areas. So the points, like the take-home messages, they usually pupate in the top 2 inches of soil. They're not going like really deep into the ground, but they can survive deep in the ground and emerge. So if you're burying fruit, you need to put it like 3 feet underground so that the pupae can't make it back up to the top. So if you're trying to just get rid of them from the soil, like with a drench or something, once that's permitted, CDFA is working on that, then it doesn't need to go deep. But then if you're burying the fruit 3 feet under the ground, and then the pupae, when they're like dropping from the fruit in the tree, they don't like to move around very far. They'll only move like 1 to 2 feet to find a spot to go into the ground. So you'll usually find them like within the drip line of the tree. The females really prefer to lay their eggs in split or damaged fruit. So field sanitation is one of the best things that you can do, like getting rid of the damaged fruit off the ground. If you are in a fruit fly area, like near a quarantine, and you're leaving fruit on the ground, that's like a breeding ground for these flies. So that's like a simple thing that will help to reduce the risk of the population growing. They're not considered a quarantine pest of avocados. The Hass avocados being removed from the host list. That's not to say that they can't reproduce in avocado, though. It's just not very common. So in Hawaii, they did an extensive study because this Shawil variety, was still on the host list. So what they found that like under normal weather conditions, you don't really find them very commonly in an avocado grove. But if the fruit's damaged by any reason, weather, birds, mice, like cracking, bruising, they can still lay an egg and develop in an avocado fruit. It's not a quarantine pest because that fruit's not getting shipped anyway. It's already damaged. But just to mention, like they can survive in an avocado. So if you're, have other crops that are hosts, or you end up nearby a oriental fruit fly quarantine, then sanitation will still help to sort of reduce the risk. Yeah, and you can't really see them. This is like an orange that has a fruit fly growing inside it. So it's pretty, when they're softer fruit, then they can just oviposit in the inside. Okay, and then one other thing to kind of lead into the,
I haven't seen this before, and so I'm just curious as to the damage. What would one be looking for? Rot with worms in it? Or...
so they're not in California, so it's kind of like we haven't seen them. There's no research in California. All the research is done in Hawaii. They're quite big larvae, like they're bigger than like a housefly or something. So they just feed on the fruit from the inside. The puncture wound makes like other mold grow. It basically, the fruit rots on the tree, and they'll develop in almost ripe, and overripe fruit. So not the young fruit that's on the tree.
I had never heard about the drench before. Is that something you could potentially put in your sprinklers? And
yeah, so the drench option isn't approved yet, but it's like in the works at CDFA. There used to be a drench option, I can never pronounce them. Yeah, diazinon, that's no longer allowed, but there's other options coming.
So fly was an issue about 25 years ago here, but we have Queensland right in the middle of some avocado orchards right now.
Oh,
so that's probably what you need to be speaking to, because Santa Rosa Valley has got a quarantine, and it's lapping over into the Las Posas Valley. It's about a mile from my house.
Oh.
And so that would be our real concern if you're talking about fruit flies. It's how close it is to a medfly and what it does and all that, because we do have it.
Okay. I didn't realize that was into commercial acreage. Yikes. Okay. Oh, okay. All right. So we need to, do some work there and how.
Are there any questions from the chat? No. Well, we got another panel to go here.
All right.
And thank you,
Thank
Bodil.
you. Yeah. Remember to
go
go down.
Going to be spraying you. What's that?
Oh, all I wanted to say about bees was like, because it's been raining, there's more weeds. Make sure you are making a proper fire break around any bees that you have. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker and moderator is Hamutahl Cohen, CAS, not Cohen. Anyway, she's our new entomologist here in Ventura, LA. And she's going to be covering Thrips management with Jane Delahoyde, Dave Machlitt, and David Holden. But first, Hamutahl is going to give an overview of Thrips.
I'm going to give you guys a really kind of brief 10-minute review of basic avocado thrips, ecology, and behavior and management. And then our expert panel of PCAs is going to go into like the nitty-gritty details on treatment and everything else we might want to know. Okay, so just general information about thrips. They're tiny insects. They belong to the order Thysanoptera. Thysanos means fringed and ptera means wing. They have these feathery wings. That's why they have that name. And there's about 6,000 species, and only about 1% are pest species. So the rest might be neutral. Maybe they eat pollen or fungal spores or decaying vegetation, or they might be beneficial. So some thrips eat other insects, or they eat mites, or they even eat other thrips. Even though thrips have wings, they're terrible flyers. So they disperse by floating on the wind over long distances, or maybe they hitch a ride on infested plants and get introduced into new areas. The major thrips species that attacks avocado in California are the avocado thrips. And both the larva and the adult cause this kind of scabby, scarry damage. It's brown. Sometimes it's called alligator skin. And the scarring is really easily confused with damage from mechanical injury, from wind rub or any kind of wind. And we're going to have our PCA panel kind of go into how to tell apart damage from thrips or from wind. One thing that's really important to note is that when there's light feeding damage, it doesn't impact the internal quality of the fruit, but if there is heavy damage, it can stunt fruit growth. So avocado thrips were first discovered in 1996 here in Ventura County, and they were most likely introduced from Mexico. Within a year of introduction, by 1997, they had spread up north to SLO and south to San Diego. And now they're considered a major pest. About 80% of orchards report spraying for avocado thrips. And they're distributed in coastal areas. They haven't been able to establish inland because they really prefer cool temperatures. Even in Ventura County, you kind of see a gradient of thrips pressure with higher pressure towards the coast and less as you go towards Fillmore. Okay, let's talk about the life cycle. So a female thrip, or thrips, because the singular still has an S. It's always so confusing. A female thrips lays an egg on a leaf or on a young fruit, and it'll go through 4 immature stages before it becomes an adult. So the first 2 stages are called instars, and those 2 stages cause feeding damage. And then the second instar will drop to the ground and pupate and go through 2 more stages. These are non-feeding stages that don't cause damage before becoming an adult. And sometimes they'll also pupate in the cracks and crevices of bark in the avocado tree. Thrips have about 6 generations per year, maybe more. This whole life cycle in warm weather takes 2 weeks, but usually it's more like 20 to 30 days to go through the life cycle. Both the larva and the adults require moderately cool temperatures. So numbers typically start increasing in the late winter and the spring, and thrips will start off on the young flesh on the foliage. And after the new leaves harden, they'll move on to young fruit. And that's when we start to see damage happen. So most of the damage that's incurred to the fruit happens when the fruit is like 0.2 to 0.6 inches long. Once it's bigger, even if thrips feed on it, you won't see any kind of subsequent damage. And then later in the season, as it warms up and dries out, the populations are naturally suppressed. And by then, the fruit's no longer susceptible to new damage. So thrips can kind of all look alike. It'd be kind of confusing to identify them. So I have some tips on how to identify avocado thrips relative to other species. So the avocado thrips have these fine black abdominal bands. Oh, does this work, this little pointer? These little fine black abdominal bands. Okay. Compared to Western flower thrips, avocado thrips are yellow. Western flower thrips can have variable coloration, but Western flower thrips, their wings don't reach their abdomen. And then it can be a little hard to see here, but they have these stout black hairs that are absent on the other species. They're also slow moving, and avocado thrips are more fast moving. Yeah, let me do that because I move around a lot. All right. The citrus thrips also look similar, but they don't have fine black bands. And that's really the key difference. And then it's also worth noting the difference between avocado thrips and greenhouse thrips. So greenhouse thrips, they look pretty different. They're black, but the immature stages are yellow. And so that can be kind of confusing. But the immature stages of the greenhouse thrips, they often carry little balls of feces. And then they're also slow moving as well. And then they tend to be found later in the season, more in the interior part of the avocado tree. And so you might notice them at a different time. Okay, natural enemies. There are some. One of the most important ones is the Franklinothrips. And these are black thrips. They have a wasp-like narrow waist with kind of a pale banding right at the top of the abdomen. And just like the avocado thrips, they go through a few kind of instars and pupation stages. They also pupate in the ground, though they pupate in a silken cocoon, which is kind of interesting. Unfortunately, we don't really know if they provide adequate control of avocado thrips. I'm really curious what our PCA panel thinks about natural enemies and avocado thrips. But these are really good species to know because they also eat mites and whiteflies. Okay, there's some other predators as well, which attack avocado thrips. One of the ones that I think is really interesting are the banded wing thrips. So they can supplement their diet with pollen or plant juice and complete their life cycle, even if they don't have enough prey. And then there's other predators, there's green lacewings, there's even a parasitoid that attacks avocado thrips. So there's some things you can do to encourage natural populations of beneficials. The first one is avoid dust. So dust creates a barrier that insects can't find their prey. It can also desiccate these natural enemies. So you can consider even rinsing off any kind of young trees that have dust on them. Another one is avoiding pesticides that are persistent or that you know have non-target impacts. And then you can also plant a diversity of plant species that will give these insects safe harbor during sprays, alternative prey. If you're interested in planting for natural enemies, UC Cooperative Extension has a lot of guidelines online with plant lists. And if you take my card, I can email you. So there are some ways to potentially mitigate damage from avocado thrips. And one of them is taking advantage of the fact that avocado thrips like the young succulent flesh, and they move to fruit only when that flesh hardens off. So one of the ideas is to prune avocado trees to encourage flesh throughout the spring, particularly pruning in January to induce additional growth during fruit set. Of course, like this is easier said than done because if it's cool, you know, that's not really conducive to new flesh growing, but, you know, pruning in order to promote that. And then another idea that I'm really curious to hear what our panel thinks about is using mulch. There hasn't been a lot of research on the efficacy of using an organic layer of mulch, but there was a preliminary study that showed that fewer thrips emerge from the ground when there's mulch applied, like 50% less thrip emergence. And using mulch can have other benefits for avocados as well. It can suppress root rot, it can suppress weeds, and so thrip control might be an added benefit as well. Okay, so monitoring. You want to start monitoring when you see new leaf flush before fruit is present. And leaf flush occurs slightly before the flowering, and it can occur continuously throughout the spring. So you want to be monitoring every 7 to 10 days. And you want to look at the leaves and the fruit. So on the leaves, you want to look at the underside of the leaf along the lateral veins, maybe the mid vein. You'll see them kind of tucked along there. And then look at the fruit as well under the calyx. And that's kind of like the little hat that connects the stem to the fruit. If you peek under there, you might see them running around. For those of you who might find it helpful, UC has a monitoring sheet that helps you calculate the average number of thrips that you're seeing. And I left it out at the front. You can grab a copy. Oh, another tip is early in the season to look on the south part of trees where flush first starts. Okay, so thrips can move fairly fast. So if you see them in part of the orchard, you may want to consider treating the whole orchard. And abamectin is kind of the treatment of choice, but there's problems with abamectin, namely pesticide resistance. So our PCA panel is going to go into how do you select a chemical control method that also helps you coordinate Purcell mite management, how do you avoid pesticide resistance? Okay, and that's it for me. Let's get our PCA panel up here, and then you guys can ask questions of the panel. Let me get my questions for them. Okay, so with us today, we have Dave Holden, Dave Machlitt, and Jane Delahoyde. And I'm going to ask them some questions to start, and then I'll open up questions to the audience. So the first question that I have for our panel is, given the avocado thrips develop well under cool temperatures, what are some tips for monitoring thrips coming into the season? What are lessons learned from last year? Do you want to start, Jane?
So say it one at a time.
What are lessons learned from last year and tips for monitoring this year?
Okay, to me, the lessons from last year were that with all the rain that we had, it was really delayed. You've got to kind of pay attention to when your fruit set is happening. So the fruit set was really late. And so, you know, when we are having the flushes and stuff like that, then you'd go around and you would see lots of thrips on the flush, but there wasn't any fruit set yet. And so on one token, you don't want to waste the spray. You have to monitor the numbers and just see how heavy the populations are getting. And I thought it was extremely tricky last year. Normally, if I saw a heavy population on young flush, I would spray anyways, because by knocking those numbers down, you're going into the season with a much lower population. And when the numbers are low, you don't get the fruit damage. So you can have some thrips out there, but you won't get the fruit damage. But last year, all bets were off. You guys have a comment?
Yeah, last year was a really tough year. It was very wet in the wintertime and then very cool and drizzly periods in the spring. And for the most part, the best time to treat for thrips is when there's abundant tender flesh on the tree, because the material that we're predominantly using is abamectin. That's a translaminar material. And if you apply it on the tree, certain part of it goes inside the leaf and stays in the leaf. The part that remains outside the leaf degrades in a few hours. The material that goes into the leaf is active for weeks and weeks. So that's the reason. The main timing in our county is putting it on when there's an abundance of flush that's expanded and still tender, and before the fruit set retention shows up. And that was really just kind of a very slow process last year. And then, you know, most of our acreage, almost all of our acreage is sprayed by helicopter at 75 gallons per acre. And largely, yeah, it's kind of like we're not using IPM because we're not using thresholds. Because if we have a limited supply of applicators to cover the acreage in avocados, and you want to hit that one primo timing. And if you count, you know, I count the infestation on the leaves, but that's not how I judge my timing. I time it by when I can get the flush, to hit the tender flush. If you wait to use a threshold, say, of over 5 per leaf, the problem with that is you're waiting for the thrips to show up. You write a rec, you go to the applicator and you give them the rec, and they'll say, we can get there in maybe 4 weeks. You have in thrips control in avocados, the way it is to get the best results, you need to treat that tender flush. You need to plan ahead. You need to get your recs written and get them in the quay to get the good timing. So, you know, large part of that isn't IPM going by thresholds, but the situation we're in makes it a much better approach. And that was really kind of thrown off this last year because of the cool temperatures, the slow development, and then the drizzly conditions during our typical application time. Because you really don't want to spray a pesticide on a leaf when it's wet, because some of the material rolls off and the concentration of the pesticide on the leaf surface is decreased. So my lessons learned is last year was really tough time.
So just so you know, Navel Oranges had the same issue last year. They had I've been talking to growers and PCAs in the valley. They had the exact same issue. And I bring this up because we hear abamectin's lost its ability to control. I don't think it is. I think it had all to do with the weather. And it didn't even get warm till July 3rd. And then it got warm and everything took off. But let me take you back to what David was saying. I did 5-6 years worth of studies with Syngenta on abamectin. And what we found out, it's better to kill 10,000 per acre than to kill 10 million per acre. And we found that if we made applications as early as Ron's back here, normally treat his trees like May 10th in a normal year. We didn't treat them till June 1st or so. But the point is if you kill 10,000 instead of 10 million and get 90% control, now you got 1,000. And you're going through these cycles. And abamectin, if you watch strips, they'll do this. That 2 week cycle is really there. It really happens. You'll kill them. They'll come up in 2 weeks, then they're dead from the abamectin sitting in the leaf, and then the next one. But what we found was it's better to go early as long as you have leaf flush. And all three of us agree on that. That kills IPM. That's the problem with it. And the fact that we only have 3 helicopters to treat about 20,000 acres of avocados between Ventura County and Santa Barbara County. It's really hard. But we found that I don't have a threshold for thrips. If I see 1 or 2 every 3 leaves, it's time to go because I've got this flush. But that didn't work this year, last year, because the fruit didn't come on until late. And so we all got fooled. So I can guarantee most of you are going to have thrips damage out there. You're going to have the cull rate go up a little bit this year. But earlier is always better.
Okay, that kind of answers the next question about timing treating thrips. I want to talk a little bit about discerning if avocado fruit damage is from wind or thrips. And I have.
Yeah, give me that. So 6 years ago, as gem planting started to increase, a number of you started blaming PCAs for thrips damage on your gems. Okay. Your damage was from wind rub, scarring. Because if you know, on young gem trees, they just put out these panicles of fruit and they just rub. And within 5 years, they start blooming more like a regular house trees. But when they're young, and so I won't name anybody, they're not here, but I had 2 growers swear to me, oh, that's thrips damage. And I said, no, it wasn't. So I asked this grower, I did a trial on my own. Nobody paid me for it. I said, I want to distinguish between thrips damage and wind damage. We did it. I went to, the commission knew about it. Tim Spann saw it. He says, well, let's pay you to do another year trial. So we put up wind screens, everything. And it was day and night. It was wind. There's no 2 ways about it. It was causing most of this gem damage. So which direction? So is that wind scar or thrips damage? Who said thrip? Yeah, I would contend that's thrip. And I would contend that's wind scar. Even though you see it coming off the top stem like that was a thrip going between the sepals. That's wind scar. And there you go. See that, how it looks like a dry lake bed in the middle of the Mojave Desert? That was very typical of what we were seeing on the gems. Okay. I had a gem planting that I was looking at right next to a Hass planting, same age. And the Hass were all hanging down like this, and the gems were like this. And it was just totally scarred up. That's what got me to thinking. But I had these 2 influential growers that are friends telling me it was thrips damage. So no, it isn't. So we went on. So there is very young fruit. That is wind. There's some more cracking like a dry lake bed. So here I have these pictures. See those 2 pieces of fruit on the left? They're sitting right next to you. Split them open. You can't really see, but there's a dark spot on each of them.
Yeah.
And that's very typical of gem setting, not Hass, but gem setting. But that's what keyed me to this. And so there's typical thrips damage on the left. I took these pictures. That was, working down from the sepals. And look at that limb rubbing against that avocado. Okay. So just distinguish, if it's really deep and rough, it's most likely wind scar. Okay. So I just want to make that clear. In gems, at 2 and 3 years of age, they're really susceptible to it by the time they get 5 or 6. So Jane, I was doing one project on Jane's avocados, which were bigger trees, more upright, more vertical gems. And I was doing on some smaller ones. They were both 12.3 miles from the coast. And they both, in Jane's orchard, the wind speed averaged 4.3 miles per hour. I remember these numbers every afternoon about 2 o'clock. The other orchard was in the Santa Clara Valley with no wind breaks or anything, and it was averaging 8 miles per hour. And the planting in Santa Clara River had majority of the damage was from wind, and in Jane's the majority of the damage was thrips. And the grower in Jane graciously let me scarp some fruit. So I just want to make that distinction.
That's great. So to summarize, wind has deeper damage. It's more likely on gem. And you have to kind of look at the context, look and see if the fruit's rubbing on one another or rubbing against a branch. So
well, the older they get, the damage really decreases quite a bit. I don't think it's a long-term issue with gems.
I'd also like to say to pay attention with the touching fruit, because if you've got the big clusters, that's what greenhouse thrips love. And so when you've got these huge clusters, growers don't like to pull fruit off, but and greenhouse thrips aren't easily killed with abamectin. They're hard to kill. And so, so once in a while it would pay to thin. That's a cultural practice.
Okay, so you brought up abamectin again. There was a couple of remaining questions about chemical control. So how do you coordinate treatment decision-making with Purcell mite management?
I'll answer that first. It's when you do treat for thrips, when you have tender flush and you maximize your residual control with abamectin on both thrips and Purcell mite in the fall. And even though when we treat for thrips and on that new flush, there's usually no Purcell mite. There might be some Purcell mite back on the older leaves, but you treat that tender flush and that material goes into that leaf and it controls typically Purcell mite through the spring. And then Purcell mite usually increases by June or July, comes down really heavy in August, controls it through that period and possibly into the fall. So that's, a backup reason for treating on those tender flush, and you get a 2-for-1 basically. And then dealing with resistance control, if you get that very good timing, then you're less likely to need to treat for Purcell mite in the fall. And abamectin is by far the best material we have for thrips control and Purcell mite control. And so in order to conserve the product's effectiveness and reduce resistance buildup, it's best if you can get by with just one treatment.
Amen.
If you have Purcell mite in the fall and it's looking pretty gnarly, I advise most of my growers just tough it out if we can. I'm really reluctant to put on a second one in the fall because
There's a lot of measles out there right now.
Yeah, because you're just fostering increased resistance and loss of activity in that material.
So I want to talk about alternatives. Doctor, help me out. Who was our PhD at Riverside that did all our avocado work and abamectin work? Dr. Morris. So he and I did 4 years worth of studies comparing abamectin to danitol. And what we found is danitol was pretty good at mimicking the control, length of control, Purcell mite control, everything as abamectin. The issue that many of us know about was that danitol can stay on the fruit a little longer than they think it can. And somebody had a major issue. In fact, we went a month before the danitol left the fruit. I was down in the packing house pulling fruit. It was a very unique year where there was an extra adjuvant put in, and it was one of those really drippy Junes, and nothing left, nothing disappeared. The oil didn't dissipate, nothing dissipated. So we think it held the danitol on longer. I still think danitol's an alternative, but it's more of a disruptive pesticide than say abamectin is, and I think that's why we're all reticent.
Scared.
And spinosad controls the thrips, but not the mites. And so you end up having to go in twice if you use spinosad. So I think we're all reticent to leave abamectin behind. The one thing I'll say is we only use it once a year. We're not going back to back to back to back to back to back.
Yes, Shawn.
I've used danitol a couple of times because I had a horrendous Purcell mite problem. And I have to say, and these are big trees put on by helicopter, it just smoked the Purcell mite. This is like in September, October, it just smoked the
And there's
Purcell
no fruit
mite.
on by then, most likely.
Yeah. And but the next year I got worms up the kazoo. Omnivorous looper and amoria.
Yeah.
Because it's a pretty broad spectrum. So
In fact, just a sidelight, when we had medfly, remember we put out the 1 ounce of malathion, dun, 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 the helicopters were flying over our houses
14 times.
Yeah. And I said, 1 ounce of malathion, it's not going to do. We defoliated all the trees because of omnivorous looper. It was in that spray zone. It was, do you remember that? Do you remember that, Jane?
Yes.
It was horrible.
Ben Faber had a good quote on that, Ben.
Ben.
It was an infestation of biblical proportions.
All right.
And it was.
It was.
Question from Zoom, right, Shawn?
Yeah, there was a question on the chat as to which pesticides you recommend for thrips. And you believe you already partially covered, but you might want to.
You guys want to clarify that? And maybe you want to add something about organic control too? While we're at it. Jake?
Organic, your main, excuse me, the main go-to would be Entrust.
Which is spinosad.
Yeah, spinosad. And with oil, I wouldn't go without it. A 2% oil, you can go a little bit higher, but I would keep it at 2%. A lot of people go really low on the oil. And I think that you get some of your persiamite when you use a good amount of oil. You need to go with on the young flush. So if you're spraying where the leaves are all hardened off, a lot of people have a tendency to try to wait until they see the actual thrips on the fruit. And when you wait for the thrips on the fruit, normally the leaf flush has already hardened off. And so you aren't getting that translaminar efficacy where the pesticide stays on the plant for that long duration. So you don't get anywhere near as long of a lasting treatment. So that whole timing thing is super important.
Fantastic response. Thank you. Okay. Any other thoughts?
And we also do use Veritran once in a blue moon. It works great. It only works for about 2 weeks. You mix it with sugar, or some people use molasses. You have to acidify it. You can't use it during fog. And so Carpinteria, there's issues. A lot of organic growing up in Carpinteria area and a lot of fog in that
And no mite
June
control.
season. 0% mite control. And that's another thing I was going to go mention with the persiamite is the importance of the irrigation in the fall when it starts getting hot. That's when the persea spike. They like warm weather. And so it's really important to be on top of your irrigation to not let the trees get stressed, because I think a stressed tree kind of triggers the persiamite to really go off.
And one thing on persiamite, when they puncture the leaf, potassium starts draining out of the leaf. And we always found that the potassium levels were really low in heavily infested persiamite orchards. And it doesn't affect the crop that you've got set, but it may affect the next year's crop when it needs potassium to move carbohydrates into that fruit. So you need to be thinking about the next spring, how much potassium am I going to put on to make up for if you had a heavy persiamite. That's just an aside, but if you have a heavy persiamite infestation, we've seen it with anything that drains the punctures the leaf. I've seen it in celery, same thing.
Fantastic. Any last thoughts about chemical control of avocado thrips?
I would like us to someday, we've had this pest, you mentioned when it first came in 1990, whenever Charlie Gribble, I think, found it. And it was at the, not to throw Milton under the bus, but it was at Milton Dietrich's little 4-acre orchard, which is right in the middle of Oxnard. Driscoll's packing house is on that site today. And I think that's where we found the first, it had to come off a boat, off of a banana boat or something that came into the harbor because it was right in the middle of town. It wasn't on any outskirts. But the point is we, after 30 years, we don't have a threshold for this pest. It's 1 per leaf, basically. David talked about 5 per leaf, but it's 1 per leaf, but we don't know if that's the right threshold. So I would encourage the university to help us. Do we really need, because I think we're, dare I say it, overspraying for this thrip because we don't want to get in trouble.
I have one more comment, and that's regarding dosage. Some people try to go half dose to try to save money. And especially if we're trying to use the abamectin once, part of it is that DPR has cut the rates into almost half. And so if you're going, it would be a half of a half dose. It's not enough. So when the materials aren't working as great as we hope they do, you've got to hit it with the best shot. It's expensive to come back a second time, especially if you're using a helicopter. So hit it with a good shot on round one, whatever it is you're using.
Your
And
pesticide is cheap. The helicopter is what costs you money.
Yeah.
And just one last comment. You're going to have something foisted on it. This will be a little political, called sustainable IPM. And that is the state's attempt to soften chemical inputs to whatever you're farming. And I'm sorry, some days you need a garden hose, some days you need a fire hose, and then some days we need to bring out the DC-10, drop in and so I just would say, if you ever get a chance to testify on this issue, I want you to know that we're going to get a lot of products taken away from us in the next 30 years. It's going to be harder to farm, whether you want to farm. And I do mainly green research. Almost all my research is biological right now. And I will tell you, it's not ready for prime time yet.
That's a great transition to our next question. Do you mind if I ask this question? If you still have yours. Okay. So the next question is about alternatives to using chemicals. So can we talk about pruning and fertilization and how to use them to promote new flush and influence thrips?
Well, I think you spoke to it. I mean, spring pruning, you want a lot of new leaves on there for two reasons. It can take the abamectin in and it keeps the thrips off the fruit. As soon as those leaves start hardening off, goes the fruit.
What was the question back there? Oh.
No way. There's not enough coverage.
The question was, can you use drones instead of helicopters for application?
Just too much leaf surface and mass to cover with a drone.
I was at the farm show on Tuesday, and there's at least 3 or 4 groups talking about pest control with their drones. I won't even talk to them. It's just too early. And we're going to have, I hate to tell you, it's going to have to be a more efficacious pesticide to be able to use a drone. If you're spraying at 1-2 gallons per acre, I just don't see it happening for a long time. It's just like autonomous robots. We're not going to see robots taking care of robots for a long time.
9/10 of our avocados aren't on flat ground. And so every drone thing that I've gone to, it's, watching it go along this flat surface. And I always ask, how does it work on a hill? And they're like, oh, I just don't think it's a good fit.
Okay, so last year what I found on my orchards was we had like one set and then we had another set maybe like a month later. So I had already sprayed for thrips and my PCA was trying to convince me to spray again and I decided not to because it was too expensive. But what are your thoughts on that type of a situation?
And I think you're 100%. That's why last year was just a nightmare. It was really, really tough. Generally speaking, that we just have a more consistent, easy flow into it. And so David's thing of going early is an easy call. And last year, yes, everything was setting up and looking like that might happen. And then we were setting fruit in August.
The damage is on that second set.
And and so, for some, I was like running around like a maniac saying, here we need to spray a second time. Here we don't.
But you didn't have the helicopter to do the first spray on some of it.
Correct. And then, as you say, the numbers are so high by then too. So, the thrips are right on the fruit.
Yeah.
It was hard to get at.
There is another alternative for thrips control only. It's not effective on Purcell, but Delegate works on avocado thrips. And it's not as cheap as abamectin.
I'm curious, a few years ago, we had a PCA tell us if kind of mentioning how the thrips stay on the new flesh versus going to the fruit once the leaves harden off.
Mhm.
If we really stay on top of our nitrogen applications, push that flush, just like keep pushing flush until the fruit gets big enough that you don't have to worry about the thrips. I was wondering what your thoughts are.
I don't think it's going to happen. The tree's going to do genetically what the tree's going to do. We keep trying to adjust crops, you talked about mulching to keep the thrips. Well, most of us avocado growers love our mulch. We have 6 inches, 8 inches of mulch already on it. And if in the study it showed 50% reduction of thrips emergence, well, 50% of 10 million is still 5 million. It's still too much. So I don't see that being, I mean, we can do the study for academic purposes, but I don't think it's practical. I don't think it's applied. But anyhow, I hope that answers your question.
So the question was, if you have a trouble identifying the thrips or seeing them, what can you use to see them in the orchard?
20 power hand lens, or you can attach one to your phone. There are devices to attach to your iPhones.
I use it like this.
But a hand lens is what we're all old. We're old anyhow. Jane doesn't have gray hair, but
I used to be able to see them with my naked eye,
I can still see them.
and I can't anymore. I can't do it anymore. But and the other point that I think someone was alluding to is, when are you safe? So you're watching your fruit size up, and when do you think you're out of the danger? Because when the fruit is about that big, you're probably okay. And so waiting for that, the majority of your fruit.
How
to
big
be-
were you telling so people on the Zoom
I
know?
would say, 2 inches.
Oh, you're way out of the woods by then. I would say once you've got a quarter to a half dollar.
I don't agree. I think you can,
we could fight over
0.6
it.
inches.
that
The
you're
other
out
people are
of
saying
danger,
no,
or,
that you're out of danger.
oh, no, I think 2 inches.
2
And the other thing is that Delahoyde thrips, I think it can feed on even a little bit larger fruit than the Thrips Purcell. And so if you have a bunch of Delahoyde out there,
Mm.
I think you can continue to see damage. So I would be, I'm comfortable with 2 inches. And if it's smaller than that, if you see thrips all over it, yeah, I'd be worried.
Let's talk about natural enemies for a second. So have you observed predatory thrips and predators controlling avocado thrips? And do you think the efficacy of predators varies with the weather as well?
Control, no. I've seen it, where last year I worked at an organic ranch, and it's the most beneficial I've ever seen. It was awesome until it wasn't. And I felt really bad because, I've never seen so many Franklino thrips. There's tons of lacewings. There's all kinds of, beneficials out there. It's hugely weather dependent. We were hoping that because it was out towards Ojai, but it was kind of along the coast. And so I was hoping that it would get hot enough and that the heat would knock the thrips out. And so I was monitoring and seeing all these beneficials and waiting, and the heat never came. And so, I was calling the grower saying, I'm sorry, but, you're going to have to spray. And by then it was the helicopter nightmare of it. And we got an opening, and the grower said, oh, I want to pick. And so the helicopter, we got skipped on that round. And then it was like a month and a half later.
Can I add to the heat? 100 degrees for 3 days, not 92 degrees for 3 days.
Absolutely. Over 100.
That's why Fillmore, we have thrift
Sustained.
damage now.
Yes.
So when we had those 119 degree days a few years ago, yeah, all bets were off, but it's got to be 100 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days.
Absolutely. 90 degrees, no, breed and multiply faster. So you're going to have more generations.
On the predatory thrips are generally common in avocados, and particularly on the new flesh as it's coming out. They partly feed on pollen, so that helps them carry over. But yeah, they're pretty easy to find in avocados, and even after abamectin treatment, they're still doing very well.
All right, question. Yeah.
Sorry. So when the abamectin actually goes into the leaf, how long does it last in the tree?
Weeks and weeks.
Yeah, the studies I did, now granted these studies are 15 years old, but the studies I did, you could pretty much figure 6 weeks of control. That may not be the case today, but that's what we saw back in 2005 through 2010.
We have one more audience question and then we'll do a Zoom question.
Especially in the gym variety, we have the tree too close to put the materials inside. And I think the coverage says probably it's like 70%. So we did the sprays on time, we believe, last year, and we still have damage on the fruit. So if the cycle of Thrips is getting longer, do you guys recommend it to spray twice?
Generally, no, because then you're going to lose Purcell control later in the year. And you don't really need a lot of interior coverage on avocados because, most of the flesh is making up the outside canopy of the tree. And the stuff that, you put on a spray and 75 gallons per acre is, quite a bit for a helicopter. The stuff that lands on the top of the leaf, like I said, goes into the leaf itself.
When I did that wind study, we did a 50-gallon simulation and a 400-gallon simulation, and there was no difference in thrips control.
The material lands on the top of the leaves, and the Purcell and thrips are feeding on the bottom of the leaves. And with the helicopter application, with abamectin at the right time, you can control them both, even though they're both habitating the bottom of the leaf. What's that? No, the material itself goes into the leaf.
And the flesh is on the outside of the leaf.
Okay, let's take a Zoom question next. Shawn.
All right. Grower says, I used a low dose of imidacloprid on young avocado tree with no fruit set for Purcell mite with great success. My question is this the correct approach?
Yeah, it's registered. I did a study. I did so many studies. I did a imidacloprid with Bayer back at Ashita, who's no longer, he's retired, but we did a study back in about 2005, and we really got great Purcell mite and thrips. The interesting thing about the thrips is you still could count a lot of thrips, but they didn't do any damage. The problem is we can't use imidacloprid anymore if anything's in bloom, except in quarantine areas, and that's very confusing. So don't ask me to pontificate on what the rules are. But the point was imidacloprid did work for both thrips and mite control, but we have issues with bees in pollination.
Great response. Okay, next question is about the different varieties of avocado. Do they have different vulnerabilities to thrips damage or require different management practices for thrips?
I think we used to say that Lamb-Has didn't get as much damage, but I don't believe that anymore. I think all three major varieties that we were using are getting similar damage from thrips.
Yeah, we know Gem does.
Yeah, Gem is definitely susceptible. Jane walks quite a few gems. I have a few.
Yeah, I think that the where you look comes in, and the gems for sure kind of set inside the tree. And so it's paying attention and being aware. And the gems, when they're, first setting fruit, I mean, it's hard the trees are so bushy. You've really got to look hard to be able to find, the fruit set and to be able to watch it. The Lamb-Has, the leaves were a lot hairier. And so I don't think you get this Purcell mite, but you will get the thrips. So I don't think Purcell is as much of an issue. Bacons.
Who cares?
Yeah, it's kind of who cares, but they seem to make it through no matter what. I don't think that I've never treated for bacons.
They're smooth skin. I mean, it could be a problem, but
I want to leave enough time for the next panel. So can we end with one more question? I'm going to bring it back to the topic of weather. So how do you account for different microclimates within a single production area or across different regions of the county?
we walk every block.
Well, and I think you got to take into consideration elevation. Think about where heat rises. There's certain microclimates. You'll go up a hill and you'll have a sweet spot halfway up the hill that is just almost like subtropical. The top of the hill might get a lot more wind. And so you may, you'll see something different at the top of the hill than you will lower. The lower elevations tend to be cooler. And so they might last longer. The thrips might last longer. I think that the coastal, we always have to be watching for thrips. You go inland to Santa Paula and Fillmore, Ojai, it'll get the heat that might possibly knock the thrips out. So you have to be very aware and watch the temperatures. And like David says, one day or 90 degrees isn't going to help you. You need that 100, you need it sustained for several days. It can't just be one day of hot and then cool and expect something to die off.
And you got to remember, we're not farming 1,000 acres of corn in one spot. We cannot customize these applications as accurately as you may want or we may want. I mean, our maximum blocks are 30 or 40 acres. We may have a grower that has 500, but they're in 10 different locations. So, if your PCA, if you trust your PCA and they say pull the plug, don't argue with them. This is very frustrating to us because we all have a combined, I hate to say this, we have 100 years of experience between the three of us right now. It's just not, I don't mean to be cavalier, but I think we know what we're doing and we all talk to one another. Or you see, we're friends enough that we can all call each other up anytime and say, what are you seeing over here? What's going on there? So it's not just individuals, it's collaborative. I don't know any PCA that I don't talk to about thrips and mites and everything else when it's happening.
Oh, thank you guys. This was really informative. Appreciate you coming today. Thank you.
Thank you. And this always raises more questions than you answer. Anyway, our next group of panelists are Lisa Tate Soury, Carl Stucky, Matias Purcell, Shawn Martin, and Derek Knobel. And the question posed to them is, what did you do last year? What will you do this year based on what you didn't do last year? What did you learn from last year? And what are you still learning about? Shawn Martin. Hello. So we have a range of farm sizes here. We have organic to truly conventional, truly non-conventional. And I think all of us are learning here at this stage as well. So before Lisa, how about we hear from our organic grower here, Shawn Martin.
General practices. Well, given the current year or last year, when a wet year here, we having some very anomalous conditions for the we haven't seen in quite a bit. A lot of rain. Last year, obviously, the timing was thrown off quite a bit with the very wet, cold spring. Hopefully, we won't see anything like that again. But a lot of rain in the orchards. I think that the timing of all the insect pests and the problems we've been discussing here today, probably a bit earlier this year, I would think, with the warm, wet conditions from the El Nino versus the kind of cold wet that we had last year. Maybe an earlier start to the spring. We don't seem to be having quite as cold of overnight lows as well. We're talking about seasonal variability. Every year is different, but we've seen some conditions here like we haven't seen in quite a bit. And coming rains, obviously really watching one's irrigation, I think, going into this spring. Does the El Nino continue or not? But we have to really watch the soil saturation. The extended avocados don't like an extended soil saturation period of wet temperatures or wet conditions in the soil and cooler temperatures. So I guess watching the irrigation seems like it would be important going forward. Especially, with the possibility of substantial rains in the spring if the El Nino were to continue. But conditions can always change rapidly, and who knows? But I'm hoping and I think we all could use a much better fruit set and better setting conditions this spring. Go ahead.
Okay. My name's Lisa. I have a fairly decent sized operation going, I guess. So I'm just going to go through kind of the things that we did or do to prepare, I guess, for the season. So first thing is, sounds so stupid and obvious, but don't irrigate before a rain. But my employees love to irrigate and they love to fertilize. So I'm always trying to pull them back. And so this year they actually irrigated right before rain. And I'm seeing a lot of issues now with my trees being really saturated, or the roots are. So we're going to probably think about putting Arondis on in the spring to try to get some root growth going at that point. But
Arondis is a fungicide, right?
Yeah.
For phytophthora.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously, like we clean out the drains, we repair our drains. We try to make sure that we've directed all of the like ditches and the rows to make sure that the water is going where we want it to go as much as possible. We're staking our trees, especially our young trees that like our gems that tend to fall over in the wind and the rain. And then we are also making sure like our wind machines are ready to go and everything's working. And also it's a good time for us to start thinking about if we're doing a replanting, getting our irrigation all set up at that time for the next year's planting. And then when it's raining and it's too wet for us to do anything, one of the things that we're all going to be having to do is wet weather nitrogen testing. So I was thinking about how am I going to do that? And it's really complicated because I don't want to be in a river in the middle of a rainstorm. So I'm not really sure how that's going to be accomplished, but that was one of the things I was thinking about, and also trying to figure out whether the nitrogen that is coming from the neighbors or the hillsides is like, what is that compared to what's coming off of my farm? So that's something we're all going to have to be working on here pretty soon. And then I use this time to train my staff when it's too rainy. So we do like our OSHA trainings and our food safety trainings. I try to schedule my gap inspections during this time of year so that it's just a better use of time. We service our wells and our equipment and clean our shops. And then this year, my PCA recommended that we do a Bordeaux and snail sprays or whatever they're applications. And then I do a lot of reports and taxes, but the reports, I know we're all feeling it, but like I report to 24 different government agencies, which probably most of us do. I just have citrus and avocado. So that's a ton of reports. And we just get 8 reports alone from the USDA. So this is the time that I usually do that stuff. And the other thing that I want to bring up, because we had an area for avocados that never really did well, and we didn't know why. And then with the rains last year, we realized that there was a natural spring there. And so that just might be something to watch out for if you are having an area that just continues to have issues. And then in the spring, we'll be doing a lot of weed control, I'm sure, and repairing roads and getting ready for our fire protection.
Thank you. Derek.
Thanks, Lisa.
Derek Knobel.
I'm not that much dissimilar to Lisa. I'm with Levens Ranches. We have operations at 3 principal avocado growing farms in 2 different counties. So we're quite spread out. And I'm going to take a little different tack because we actually had a practice session and these guys know way more than I do. But I'm going to give you a little bit more of an operations manager perspective. And when a wet winter is coming, I kind of break it into 3 periods. You got the before rain, the during the rain, and the after rain effects on your orchards. I read the California Avocado Society newsletter. I look at those advanced forecasts. We pretty well know with El Nino forecasting or wet weather is coming. We don't know when, we don't know how much, but we know. And so I just switch my brain thinking to that. I'm in charge of the budget, so I kind of shift my money around looking for things. I make sure my erosion projects that got blown out another year are finished. I really have to focus on my staffing at that time of the year to make sure that they're all not taking vacation at the same time, which is generally when things are cold and slow in the winter. everybody can go on their vacations. Well, you got to treat a wet year a little bit different to make sure you have your rapid response force on hand and available, because you will need them. Obviously, before the rains come, these late fertilizations are kind of important, probably in November, because you may not have a chance to get it on without risking overwatering, like what Lisa said. Irrigations are very tricky during that time. We focus on drainage, but we really focus on our young trees first. Everybody knows how to clean the old trees and take care of them, but your young plantings are going to behave differently. So we really got to focus on that. Over time, I know it's really hard. Water runs downhill pretty easy, but dirt doesn't go uphill very easy. So every dollar in prevention and maintenance that's spent during a pre-wet year is probably worth it. I make sure my machinery that's critical is up to snuff early rather than save it for a winter project. I make sure that I have the rental contacts on my Rolodex and my credit apps ready for action. During the rain year, we're going to talk a lot about that, but I've also got to give a little bit of time to talk to the field departments to make sure our cultural activities are kind of in sync with what they can pack, because everything's a lot more compressed during a wet year. Later starts, aggressive activities if you're cultural pruning. I do find that irrigation in some of our sandy waterlogging soils is very tricky. I've seen last August rain, young trees just die off. You irrigate them and they got 3 inches of rain, kapow. So you really got to watch that. If you have major problems, notify NRCS. They have emergency conservation funds that are pretty easy to get on the list. Obviously, keep your water off those trees. After the season, though, with wet weather comes big weeds, big brush growth, and fire prevention. So I switch the hats. So I try not to skimp on springtime, summertime vegetation management on my perimeters. That said, I'm not quite sure what to do about the mustard, which grows well, long, and great. And I heard it's a good pollinator, right? Or a good habitat to keep. So I'm a little bit troubled. Maybe Carl can answer that one.
Carl, Stucky.
Mustard is an interesting cover crop. Bees would like to get nectar out of avocados, and they will actually stay in the orchard a little better with mustard because they'll get the pollen out of the mustard. It's just hard to control. If you're using weed whips to cut weeds in the orchard where you don't want to get your tractor in, mustard is really hard to cut. We've found that if we cut it more often and keep it small, then it does provide a little beneficial habitat in the orchard. And it gives you a little diversity in insects. It attracts flower thrips. You'll see predaceous thrips readily on mustard crop.
Do you think it's flammable, Carl? I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I was going to ask you anyway.
Well, when it dries up, it's flammable.
Yeah, that's the challenge in a wet year.
But if you had it cut down low, then, of course, you've minimized your fire spread conditions. So we do cover cropping. I like to call it biorational. So we're kind of a mix of techniques. We burn down our cover crops at the start of the winter so that we don't have too much cover. We need that extra degree or two of warmth that we get out of some bare ground. We seed cover crops during the winter. Usually in late January, February, we're looking for a month or a couple weeks of drier weather that we can get in and seed cover crops that we have it coming up during the spring. And utilizing the rains, winter rains, to get it germinated and growing. We'll burn that down again with herbicide in the springtime, minimize water competition with the avocado trees. Some of the other things we've talked about, fertilization. I generally avoid fertilization during the winter. This last spring, as cool as it was late in the spring, nitrogen fertilizers have to convert to a nitrate form to be taken, or ammonia form to be taken up by the tree. And when it's cool, that time it takes to convert to a usable form of nitrogen for the tree is longer. And if nitrogen being very water soluble will disappear in heavy rains, push it down below your root zones. So we generally, not generally, we do not put on nitrogen during the rainy season. I used to start potassium a little earlier to have it ready for flowering. Arnon Dag, specialist in pollination from Israel, talked about potassium, bees not liking potassium applications in the trees, made the flowers less desirable. So now I'm rethinking when to start potassium applications. Rain or not rain, of course, when we have a heavy winter in retrospect, we can say that, well, we shouldn't have done that irrigation and we should have done something else a little earlier, and then we should have put off other things until afterwards. But you never know. Lisa talked about not irrigating before a rain. Is it going to rain? If the trees are getting to, depends on our winter weather. Now we can go most any time of year and have 75-degree days with relatively high evapotranspiration rates. I hesitate to put trees into a little bit of stress, even in the wintertime, if we're in that really warm kind of weather and the trees have used up the available soil moisture. We would tend to irrigate, but do a real shallow irrigation and leave our deeper soil parts of the soil profile a little drier. So we don't stop irrigating during the winter. I know I've consulted for a couple of growers wondering why they had so much defoliation with flowering, but it turned out to be not a heavy rain winter, and they hadn't irrigated all winter. So the trees went into springtime flowering in a state of stress, and you don't want that. We treat every rain when it comes to maintenance and drainage systems. We treat every coming potential rain as potentially a heavy rain. When the forecast says it's going to rain 1/10 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, we consider the possibility that rain may rain 3 inches. So our maintenance on the drainage systems, we treat every coming rain as a potentially heavy one. This last storm, we had some pretty high forecasts for rain amounts that didn't materialize, thankfully. Up in Carpinteria, we had seen some reports that talked about 6 to 8 inches and 12 to 14 inches along the mountains. It's a short distance to the ocean. That's all runoff that comes through our creeks, creates flood conditions. So we're glad we didn't get those kind of high amounts. But I have also seen the opposite, where the forecast was for 1/4 of an inch, and we got 3 or 4 inches of rain over a couple of days and some high rates. So we treat every rain as a potentially a heavy one when it comes to maintenance. Our other wintertime activities, ranch is bordered by wildlands, native chaparral on a couple sides. So we have a constant influx of gophers. So we treat those wildland interfaces really hard during the wintertime when it's slow, trying to minimize the inflow of gophers. We still get them, but we're not as busy with other day-to-day activities, so that's something we really concentrate on in the wintertime. And then the regular catch-up, like Lisa talked about, paperwork and reports and reading all those things from the water board that we didn't get around to reading. We're in a different region up there than you are down here. So we have our own set of requirements and things that need to be reported to them. Run a nitrogen reporting program that I just finished doing earlier this week. It kind of covers it, Matt.
Yeah. Matias Purcell from Brokaw Nursery.
Morning. Morning. Yeah. So one of the things that we saw during last spring was it was a very humid and cold spring. and that tended to prolong and delay the flowering process on the avocado trees. So you gotta choose the right time to bring your bees. And last spring, I would say we might have been better off keeping the bees for a longer period. So when you get those conditions, your chances of developing fruit set are slimmer. So it might be a good practice to keep your bees and maybe add an additional beehive to the acre. In terms of irrigation, we always check on our soil moisture probes and the dendrometers in order to find the right time to start irrigating. I know it's very, very hard to find the right starting time after a wet winter, so we check on those. And also, since it rains so much, you're going to have an abundance of native flowers and weeds. They also produce flowers, and that's a competition for the avocado flowers. So yeah, a really good weed control. And again, if you have a lot of native flowers in your surroundings, it would be advisable to add an additional beehive to the acre. Also, you must have, after a wet winter, you must have an effective management strategy against Phytophthora, and also add some fungicide to the mix, such as Orondis.
Thank you. I'd like to go through the whole panel again because this might have stimulated questions, but
yeah, I mean, just thinking further about like some of the stuff that was raised here, but spending a lot of time doing heavy brush clearing on the steeper parts of the fire breaks and stuff, you know, when we have these wet years, and it's we have a real issue with steep terrain where you can't get in with a lot of normal equipment, and the only way you can cut some of this heavy materials with, you know, blades, metal blades and chainsaws, and a really good time to be clearing and thinking of way ahead of the fire danger. But like speaking of the mustard, you know, mustard is nice and green and soft. You cut it with a string early on, but if you wait, that stuff becomes real woody, and the only way you're going to get it out is with a metal blade. But if you waited till it's fire conditions, you're going to kind of self-prophesying there, creating problems. You know, pruning during the winter, you know, and these wet winters can be really dicey. I like to prune during the winter because I think it's less stressful on the trees and the pruners. But, you know, really watching the weather and trying to make sure that you have dry periods and the trees have time to heal those wounds. A lot of stuff with, you know, maintenance on the farm, on vehicular maintenance or regulatory paperwork is being done this time of year. I had a similar problem last year with a young block of gem trees. Thought, oh, okay, it's time to irrigate them. You know, it was in April, as I recollect, you know, and went ahead and pulled the trigger on watering them. And then it just turned around and got super cold and wet, and they were in a tight clay soil, and the trees looked miserable. And it was a long time for those to pull around. So, you know, especially on these wet winters, never fail to irrigate if it gets dry. And there's, you know, I haven't irrigated this winter, but there was a period where it was very close. We had some temps up in the upper 80s for a few days, and, you know, things were getting quite dry. But fortunately, the rain came back, but I never failed to irrigate or let them dry out, even in the middle of winter. It's always prudent to stay on your irrigation, whether it be irrigating or abstaining from irrigating, you know, and it's a judgment call. You can never be perfect on it, but really keep an eye on that. Cleaning out the debris basins or your drains and that kind of stuff is paramount. Like you said, Carl was mentioning, always preparing for a heavy rain. This year, I kind of dropped the ball a little bit, thinking the first rains weren't going to be that heavy over the Christmas holiday, and we got 12 inches of rain in that first series. Fortunately, it was on dry soil, so it soaked up quite a bit of it, but you never really know. I've never seen that much in the 26 years I've been on the site, you know, fall that quickly and that early on. So, yeah, it's always try and be prepared as much as you can, you know, but be willing to, adaptable. You know, that I think is the number one thing in farming, is to be adaptable and ready to change your game plan at the moment's notice, and, you know, to go the other way, follow the weather and the conditions.
Welcome to avocado farming. Fire, frost, flood, Phytophthora, all sorts of stuff. You had something to say, Lisa?
Yeah, we lost 50 acres on 3 different ranches in the Thomas Fire of avocados. And I learned a lot from that. So I'll just share kind of what we learned. The first thing is that you will not have any support by the fire department at all. Like they stand there and watch it burn, and all they do is structure protection. So that's just something to know that you're on your own. And the thing that I didn't realize was that fires burn for weeks, both above ground and below ground. You find out really quickly when you fall into a hot hole that all the roots underneath the ground had just been burned. So I think there's things you can do yourself, obviously not when it's like that first blow through and the winds are, crazy and you don't want to put yourself in danger, but we also have go bags now prepared for our staff. And so those bags have goggles and masks and knives and gloves and a shovel and a first aid kit. And so we have those in the scenario where, because what happens is the leaves, the mulch is what catches on fire. And then it's the slow burn. It's like lava kind of coming at you. And we also learned that our hoses work as just a fire highway. So if you cut the hose and you can kind of stop the spread pretty drastically just by cutting a hose and then separating it from the other part of the hoses. And then the other thing is, Edison always turns the power off right when we need it to run our pumps and stuff like that. So we've invested in generators so we can at least run our well or run our systems in those circumstances. We've also figured out we're on a lot of hillsides. And we have a reservoir. So I have a plan of how to gravity feed, also at least protect some stuff. So anyway, that's just some of the things that I've learned through that.
Derek, you've been writing. You have something to add?
I'm just writing down all the good things I'm learning, to be honest.
Well, we've got go ahead.
Everyone at this table is a little bit different. Shawn, small, dedicated organic grower in Casitas area, looking at the coast.
Yes.
Lisa, Santa Paula, maybe a little heavier soils, some hillside, some flatland. We're all over the place. So when we talk irrigation, it's all different. Carl's soil and Carpinteria, a bit different. Matias, pretty severe hillside plantings going on. So we're all a little bit different. So when we talk about the irrigation, it's really site dependent. And that is one of the trickiest things I think there is to do during the winters. And this winter, we couldn't stop because those November rains came completely differently. I mean, we expected a little bit more. We got half an inch. So we couldn't take our foot off the throttle. So you got to increase your monitoring, increase your probing. I love the idea of the dendrometer, which is giving you a true picture. But any of those tools are what we need to use to get better at these wintertime and even springtime irrigations. But this year we're about the same water that we had last year. It just came differently. We're anywhere from 13 to 17 inches, somewhere in there, right? But last year came and was steady and easy and soaked up, and we could turn pumps off and relax a little bit more as long as you were monitoring your trees. What we did notice though, with those late rains in March, something happened with our bloom. So all this is happening, and you heard the insect presentation. This definitely affects our bloom. So we may get all 30 inches this year by the end of January. We don't know if it keeps up. And then we've got to figure out what cycle we're on. So I think just paying attention to your trees is a really good example. Pay attention to your soils. Good points on fertility. We're in sandy soils, so we're still getting warm soil uptake on these long flushes that we're seeing through November. So I know I can't water in the middle of maybe February or March or April when I normally could. So I'm going to try to pop it a little hard, order up a little bit more nitrogen, long-lasting forms, and go with that. But watch the pattern of the rains relative to your trees in as much as you're watching the quantity.
and have the beehives ready to act whenever they.
Yeah, they're gonna fly over to your house. I mean, some beautiful flowers up there.
We've got a question from the
Yeah,
Zoom.
we have two questions.
Okay.
One was for Carl. What are the cover crops you plant?
If I'm adding seed, I usually use a low growing legume mix that I source through a seed supplier. And it has a variety of legumes. Most of them low growing. They're fairly fleshy, so they're easy to cut. We usually terminate it before they produce seed. Most of the legumes produce seed as they dry out, as they use up soil moisture. We have it planted in areas that we're irrigating with micro sprinklers. So we usually terminate the crop. We end up cutting it a couple times by hand, and then we'll spray it down with herbicide to minimize our competition during this spring and summer.
And just a note on cover crops, if you're using a soil sterilant, it won't work to plant seeds.
Question over here.
Okay, and the other question is for all panels. Has anyone in the panel studied Brix levels in avocado trees, and how can we improve levels?
The Brix levels, the sugar levels. Has anyone studied Brix in avocado?
I haven't in avocados, but in coffee. I just found this year that I think it was because it was so cool for so long, and I don't think that the plants were bringing up a lot of nutrients during that time period. So we had much lower Brix this last year than the year before.
Dave Holden, wait a minute.
Brix.
Brix is totally potassium dependent. You want all the potassium in that leaf you can have, and you will, potassium acts as a flatbed truck for carbohydrates. Carbohydrates leave the leaf, go into the fruit, go into the roots. It's all potassium dependent. So that's why how you increase sugars, carbohydrates in any fruit. I don't care if it's strawberries or lemons or avocados. Thank you.
But the question more is, what level do you need? And if you believe our known dog, if you get too high a level, the bees won't go to the nectar because it's poisonous to them. Matias, do you want to add something?
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention, the use of berms. Berming helps a lot, especially on this type of events. Yeah, they give the proper drainage and aeration for the root system. So yeah, I would suggest if you're planning to start your orchard, yeah, berming, it's a must.
And in a hot climate like Fresno, is that a good idea? Because in a cold climate, they really do provide warmer roots and more growth. But watch out for them if you're in Fresno. Any questions from the audience?
I want to add something about berms.
Oh boy.
Berms on hillsides. I think in a rainy season, there's real concerns about soil erosion.
Yeah.
We visited an orchard recently, in the last summer, that went through last winter, and the soil erosion where workers were going to have to access to pick fruit would have been almost impassable on a safe in a safe way. So you really need to consider on ground that is sloped, if you're concentrating the water down the narrow area between berms, that you are doing something to mitigate soil erosion. And I think Derek said, the water goes downhill, but the soil never goes back uphill.
Yeah.
And you can't afford to lose it. And many of the techniques that are available for avoiding soil erosion were developed post Dust Bowl. They're not new. And some of them were probably developed back with the very beginnings of agriculture.
Question back
One
here.
more question. Did you have a lot of drop as a result of last year's rain to all the panels?
Did you have a lot of fruit drop from last year's rains? Did you have any fruit?
Well, one of the things that we know is that these rains are coming with pretty severe winds. I've just noticed that since 2020, you get these fake outs. And so the answer is yes, we're losing fruit due to the winds. In very severe conditions, you will see some fungal activity in certain trees that will grenade fruit just before springtime. And that's kind of disappointing, but it wasn't rampant even with our 30-inch of rain. So there's obviously some stem challenges or some things going on those trees, but maybe, stress or something made them more amenable to the fungal organisms.
Sosin's got a hot question.
Another question is, any idea on how to keep young trees from asphyxiation, drowning after heavy rain and wet winters?
Pray. I don't know.
But we didn't talk about mulching. So young trees, we generally, we're liking these mulches. We're maybe getting some grant money to put mulch out there. And mulch timing is very important. I haven't heard it mentioned yet, but it's great to have the mulch, but you want to get it on much before the rains ever kind of show up that particular year. That's my advice, or I think Shawn had written down somewhere, wait till the spring when you can get back in. Spring may become summer if it's really wet. But what we've done in the past where we've mulched, and we just did this, and we're kind of going like this, we had to peel all the mulch away from the underneath the canopy of these young trees. So don't be afraid. Don't wait if you're starting to see some slowdown of growth on your mulch trees.
I think it's so hard in these wet years with the young trees. I mean, we've lost quite a few.
I would concur that young trees in a wet year are a really difficult thing. Young trees are they're babies, and the irrigation is tantamount importance. The older trees can take the flooding, they can take much more aridity. The young trees, the irrigation and the timing is just tantamount importance. Kind of knowing that, that they really suffer from wet feet, that berming or mounding, even if you're not going to plan on really large berms, I always mound the small trees at least 6 to 12 inches above the grade. Mulching them, I think, is a good idea, but I don't think, for me, it would be mulch when they're planted in the spring, or that keep it away from the trunks by all means on the berm or the mound you're planning on. Then that's just, it's just always a gamble on which year you plan on. I planted some trees in the fall going into the previous winter where we had real heavy rains and then really cold conditions. And it's just a gamble. That was a really tough year because we had the cold, wet followed by the cold, wet spring. And it was kind of the double whammy. And then now we've had a great mild summer without the heat and kind of an extended fall with great weather going, or, winter didn't really show up cold until January. And we had a nice extended fall in December and a nice period of low stress conditions for the trees. We've had not a lot of really cold overnight lows through this winter. All of that is a long period of low stress in the trees, which is almost always going to equal good things in the avocado. It's uninterrupted periods of stress where you have no stress for a long time is always helping the tree to build energy and lead to good cropping and good thing. It's those stress events, whether it be heat, wet, cold, all these things are kind of setting the trees back in their stress. And the question was asked also about the fruit drop in the winter. Last year we had 45 inches of rain. And we had some fruit drop, but not too bad. It's always the wind that seems to drop the fruit for us. We're up on a steep mountain and the wind just cuts right in on the storms. There's no real protection and a lot of fruit on the ground. We had real severe winds with this last storm series and there's, fruit all over the ground. So I don't think in some areas it may be the soil moisture that's causing the drop. For us, it's just the wind usually. So every site's different.
I want to say something about just like we've noticed where you plant your baby avocados makes a difference too. And you need to know your land. And just because you want to plant an avocado doesn't mean that that's a good space for it. And so there's places on our property that you can see it's just like a hill, two hills coming together, and there's like a little valley there, and they never do well there. It just accumulates too much water. So, you know, I probably won't replant in those areas knowing that now.
Okay, thank you so much. Now you can go back to work.
Lots of paper.
Our next meeting is April 15th, and it's going to be down in Escondido, and it's going to be a hybrid Zoom. So you can tune in from here, or you can drive down to Escondido.